Hi, it's Tod of Tod's Workshop here. I'm at the History Market in Compiègne in France, and I have some crossbows behind me. I've been asked to talk a little bit about the history of crossbows. Really we can start at the beginning, where the ancient Greeks had a type of crossbow called a gastrophetes that was very similar to the Roman artillery that came later. So it had a trigger mechanism that slid up the crossbow, and you actually loaded it. A gastrophetes, it's a belly bow. You load it by pushing down on it. The Romans then took the ideas of the trigger system and the way it worked, and they developed that into their artillery, into their ballistas and their catapultas. And then later on, they started with that. By around about the 3rd or 4th century AD, the Romans had invented a handheld machine called an Arco Ballista. The Arco Ballista uses exactly the same trigger mechanism as the medieval crossbows did. So what has happened now for the small handheld machines is the Romans stopped using the Greek and the Roman system, and they moved on to what is called a rotating nut. So the trigger system of an Arco Ballista is exactly the same as this 15th century crossbow. So what happens?
Don't fall down.
Yes, we can. Yeah. So what happens is you pull the string back. This particular bow has a draw weight of 380 pounds. So around about 120 kilos to pull the string back to here. The string is held, and then when you pull the trigger, the nut rotates and allows the string to fly. This system was used by the Romans as an Arco Ballista. The Arco Ballista had a composite bow, so a bow made of horn and sinew, not of steel, and the stock was a little different in shape. That particular design of crossbow, developed by the Romans, lasted really until about the year 1100. Around about the year 1100, they started to make crossbows that looked much more like this. In the early days then, in the east, so where if you go to Byzantium, as it was then, they would still use a composite crossbow limb. In the west, we used wood, so we used yew. So you would have a bow made of yew. It stayed that way really until about 1250, 1300, when we started using composite bows in Western Europe. That technology was probably brought back through the Crusades, and so we used composite bows for a long time. Around about 1380, we developed the technology to use steel bows. Steel bows are very inefficient. They do not make a great crossbow, but they're easy to maintain. So for a soldier's equipment in a fighting environment, they're much better than a composite bow, or much easier to look after. But a composite bow will shoot faster and further, but it's also a lot more expensive. So some countries, like Germany for instance, even though it's very difficult to look after a composite bow in Germany because of the weather, they still use them a lot. Whereas in Italy, actually, they use composite bows, but then they also pioneered in Italy steel bows. So they were very, I suppose, because of the Renaissance, they were very forward-looking. Before, do I have one? Yeah. If your bow is a composite or a wooden crossbow, you need to tie the bow onto the stock using a cord. And that of course stops the bow moving. Now, you can do that with a steel bow, as I've done here, and that's absolutely fine. If you use a composite bow, a horn and sinew bow, you have to tie it on, because what you can do, if it is steel, is use bow irons like this, and they clamp the bow very tight and very hard. And what is very good about this is you can take the wedges out and the whole thing will come apart. What that allows you to do is to maintain your crossbow easily, and you can look after your crossbow easily. which is why it's, for the military environment, it's a very useful thing. However, for a composite bow, you cannot do that. So you have to use a bridle like this. Around about, well, they didn't put sights on bows until around about 1500. And what started to happen around the year 1500 is firearms started to become very important in warfare. Much more, even though they had firearms in 1450, the bow was still very important. Round about by 1500, firearms are beginning to take over from the bow, either a crossbow or a longbow. And what that means is that as a military object, the crossbow is now falling out of use. But what that also means is it was still used for hunting.
Hunting, yes.
For hunting, great deal, for centuries. But what that means now is the people who hunt have money. And so at that point they start looking for ways to show their wealth and to make things better, because this must have a simple trigger system because it must be cheap. A hunting bow is owned by a rich man. He does not need a simple hunting trigger system. So what they start to do now, around about 1500, is triggers become much more complicated. At the same time, they start doing things like putting sights onto the crossbow. That hadn't been there before. They invent the bolt clip to hold the bolt into place.
For the square, don't fall.
Well,
Oui.
yes, but take that bolt. If there's no clip, if you point the bow down, the bolt will fall off. But actually, that would mean that this would be the world's most useless weapon for a castle. And they were not useless weapons for castles. So all you do then is you just put your thumb on the back and then you shoot down. And the string will go under your thumb. It won't hurt you. So you do not need this. If you're rich and you want to go hunting and you're riding your horse and you don't want to look like a fool with the bolt falling off, have a bolt clip. But there's no need for them. And so military crossbows tended not to have them. And then as bows become more powerful, actually I'll show you this system here. This crossbow on the wall is 180 pounds, 180 livres. So it's possible to draw this by hand. You do not need another mechanism to do that. This one is 380 pounds. So you cannot pull this by hand. So people started to invent new devices, whether it is a belt, or in this case it is a goat lever, and you can put that onto your bow, and now you can draw it back. This is 380 pounds, it is on one finger. So you may see how efficient this system is. So that has a limit to how powerful you can make your bow. You can't really go above about 600 pounds in draw weight, but you can make a steel spring which is much more powerful. So they use other systems. So this bow here uses a windless system where the series of gears, of wheels and cords is an old system. They've been using this for hundreds of years, but not on smaller crossbows, on large rampart crossbows. But this bow steel here is 880 pounds in draw weight, so around about 400 kilos in draw weight. So for this system, you need something better. So here you have a windlass, and even though it is 800 pounds, you may see again there is no difficulty in loading it. But don't let go of the levers when you... And then after it is loaded, you take that off and the bow is ready to shoot. And what this does, it allows you to shoot so here are 3 bolts. That one will shoot well, from a 180-pound bow, but you can see it is a very small bolt. It weighs around 20 grams. It'll hurt you, but it will not go through armour. It is not a devastating weapon. This one, again, it weighs about 30 grams, I think. This is suitable for a 400-pound bow, maybe a little bit more weight. So again, it's not the most devastating weapons. And this is a bolt for the 880-pound bow. So here you can see that you've got the bolt head alone weighs about 60 grams, 65 grams, and then you have the four faces on it for armour piercing. And then what is interesting also, if you look at the flights,
yes.
can you see that they're helical, so they're not straight, they're at an angle, but they're also curved. And what that does is it gives the bolt a great deal of spin as it flies through the air. So in that way it's essentially quite an accurate weapon as well. Would it go in?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Because it exists another sort of very dangerous.
Yes, this is against armour, but you can have ones with barbs on it. But to give an idea, this gives about 1/3 of the energy of a modern pistol bullet, 9mm pistol bullet. So again, in terms of energy, this will give about the same energy as a .22 long rifle.
In middle age,
Yeah.
it's not that. It's more dangerous.
But for us, this seems like a very weak power. But in the medieval time, this was a powerful weapon. Yeah. Is there anything else that you would like to know about?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, that was.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.